It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Miss Katherine Nelson. Everybody here at IRRI calls her Katie. Yes. She currently works as an agronomy extension consultant in the IRRI Training Center. Her work involves redesigning the Rice Knowledge Bank with a focus on extension and farmers, and she is also facilitating Rice Survivor on experience-based training program. Katie earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from University of Colorado and completed the master's in agronomy from Cornell University in January 2013. Her thesis research was multidisciplinary, bringing together agronomy, agricultural economics, and gender research to understand farmers' trade preferences for wheat varieties in Ethiopia. This research was funded through the Durable Rust Resistance in Wheat project involving CIMIT and 22 countries. Katie coordinated, designed, and implemented the gender initiative of the IRRI-Social project for her master's thesis entitled Analysis of Farmers' Preferences for Wheat Variety in Ethiopia, a gender-responsive study. Katie has presented her research at international conferences and workshops, including the 2011 Berlog Global Rust Initiative Annual Conference and IRRI Gender Workshop in Ethiopia in 2012. In the recent International Women's Day celebration here at IRRI, she presented some elements of her research, including the design for a gender-responsive preference study, which was then followed by an open discussion to participants on how the research can incorporate gender-responsive methods to increase impact and funding. This afternoon, she is interested to present on the topic of consumers' preferences to our division so she can stay connected to the area of social science research and share her experiences as well. So let us all welcome Ms. Katherine Nelson.
Thank you very much for coming to listen to me this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about what I did my thesis research on, and I do realize that it's on wheat and not rice. So whenever I say wheat, you can just replace the word with rice, because I think it's very much relevant to the work that we do here, and these kinds of methods and techniques can certainly transfer. And I also think that this, my date was originally supposed to be April 19th, I think, for giving this presentation, but it comes timely that they moved it forward because Maddie gave his talk yesterday, and it is a similar style of looking at marketing techniques and preferences. Maddie focused more on an urban consumer and what their preferences are for the food, whereas I'm going to focus more on rural growers, so producers who are also consumers because they grow the food and eat it themselves, and more of an agronomic traits as opposed to the food traits. So anyway, we'll get started. So some of the reasons why Ethiopia was chosen, as Ami mentioned before, I worked on the Durable Rust Resistance in Wheat project, which is a large project funded, and a lot of the breeding goes through CIMIT. Ethiopia is one of the countries that they work in, and wheat is a really important crop there. It's the third largest cereal crop and comprises 16% of the total land area, which covers 1.5 million hectares. They have relatively low average production at about 1.8 tons per hectare, and they import a lot of wheat, so there's an opportunity to increase yields and then also food security. So the rust disease is a particularly virulent disease against wheat. There's several different kinds. There's yellow rust and stem rust, and there's a race at the bottom here called UG99, which you can see there, that was previously stem rust was thought to be eradicated completely from wheat for basically the past like 40 years. But biology tends to come back and haunt us, and so breeders became kind of complacent about breeding against it, and so there was a strain called UG99 that appeared in Uganda in 1999, and they're basically like 90% of the world's wheat is susceptible to this kind of rust. Again, yellow rust is just really bad all the time in Ethiopia. You get an average of 20% yield loss, but there was an epidemic in 2010 that caused anywhere from 70 to even 100% losses in farmers' fields that were not treated or treated late. So that's why it's an ideal place to look, because they can do breeding for shuttle breeding for testing for rust resistance. And also, the Ethiopian Institute of Agriculture Research releases several resistant varieties every year. So just in the last 5 or so years, they've released about 20 different varieties. But they spend very few funds on actually multiplying the varieties or promoting the varieties, and so very few varieties are ever adopted. About 5 varieties account for more than 90% of resistant seed in the country, and 1 variety accounts for 90%, for more than 45% basically of the 90%. And some of the issues are not just adoption, but there are limitations in seed multiplication. People can't afford to purchase seed, it's too expensive, they can't get it. But I'm going to look more at adoption factors. So Digaloo is the one that's pictured there, is the variety that accounts for more than half of the 90%. And this one was released in 2005, and while I was there in 2011, they had already noticed that it was breaking down to rust. So it has just single gene resistance, and so as soon as it starts breaking down, it's pretty much done. And if you guys know, it takes 10 to 12 years for a variety to really become popularized in a country. So by the time halfway to there, they're already breaking down for resistance. So it's an issue. There needs to be more varieties, and they also need to have multiple gene resistance. So the motivation for the research then is that there's low adoption of improved varieties in Ethiopia, despite many being released. Not much research exists on farmer preferences and acceptability of improved varieties. And then also gender is thought to influence varietal acceptance, but there's very little research on how gender affects preferences for traits. So I worked in this area called the IRRI region, and that region was chosen because it's a major wheat producing area in Ethiopia. And it also has several different agroecological zones. So within a relatively short distance, you can get to drought, lowland areas, midland, and highland waterlogged areas. So there's a lot of variation between different kinds of varieties that are needed for that area. So some of the objectives of the study, and so basically I'm just going to walk through sort of how I looked at different questions and then what kinds of techniques I used to look at them. So one of the things is to identify subjective properties of wheat quality. And some reasons why I did that is because I'm not from Ethiopia. I don't really have any idea what Ethiopians like about wheat. And so for me to just go in and say, well, I could make a guess that they like these 4 or 5 things would be incorrect. So I needed to do focus group discussions and sort of hash through some of those. Then to determine the important wheat traits, I used quantitative surveys and a factor analysis technique. I did interviews to understand gender roles in wheat production. This is more the area that I'm going to focus most of this talk on today, which was the conjoint analysis method, where I used, again, another quantitative survey method to document farmers' perceptions of different combinations of traits to determine the value that each trait has on the whole product. Then I used cluster analysis to identify different segments of farmers with similar preferences, and multinomial logit in order to categorize membership into the preference segments based on different demographic, management, and usage preferences, or usage information. So just a little bit about designing a gender responsive study, and I mentioned this because this whole study was actually funded by the gender part of the DRW project. So some of the things we did in order to focus on the gender responsiveness of it were to schedule interviews on separate days and times for men and women, mainly because when men are present, they tend to dominate the conversation, and so women don't have much chance to speak their mind. And when you're asking about what people like, it's really important to hear from them and not to have their husband or whoever tell you what they like. And also, when possible, women farmers were interviewed by women extension or enumerators. And I say when possible because sometimes we had a very small group of people that were working with me. I just had 2 people, and I interviewed 305 farmers in about 3 weeks. So we used the extension agents from that area as well, and so sometimes they were actually most of the time they were male extension agents. So we invited women to bring their children. We invited women to come in the morning because that was identified as a less busy time for them. And we met at 2 different locations so that we didn't have the bias of just people that live nearby coming to that area, or at least not the bias of people living nearby one area. I guess we were biased by people living near 2 areas. And we included both female heads of household and wives in male-headed homes. Most of the time in these kinds of studies, only female-headed households are included, and the wives are not, their opinions are not taken much seriously. So the positioning analysis part of this study looked at the perception of existing varieties. And so what I was looking there is what kind of factors or traits drive farmer intentions to grow a variety, and how are improved and local varieties perceived by farmers. So this was done in 4 different districts in different zones, different agroecological zones. You can see there's highland, waterlogging, midland, lowland, and then midland but far from a road area. The size of this is relatively small, but this is just to get an understanding of what kinds of traits people like that I'm going to use later in the conjoint study. So the way this was done is that farmers rated a familiar variety, and so there was a long list of those plus any other ones that they mentioned, and they said they were either not familiar at all, they were familiar or very familiar. And that meant that they had grown the variety sometime in the last 5 to 10 years. And then they rated how well it performed against these 38 traits and their willingness to grow that variety for the next season. And so these traits are just kind of compromise as many things as came up in discussions with researchers and people I talked to in Ethiopia. So you'll see some on here like malting quality, color for tala. Tala is a beer type of product that's made from wheat there. So just trying to get as many different things that might affect people's different preferences for different colors of wheat or different varieties or local types, those kinds of things. So then their rating of the different varieties that they know were then subjected to a factor analysis using principal components method. And what that basically does is it takes their rating of how a certain variety rates against different traits. And it looks to see at the correlation between the traits to determine if a smaller number of traits can be used to explain the variability. Because 38 traits is way too many, basically. So what the technique is that you can use this Kaiser criteria to show that there's basically 4 main factor areas. And those areas I've named quality, agronomic, yield, disease resistance, and harvest. But that's just based on what makes up the most in that column. And so basically what contributed the highest factor loadings were these 6 traits. So rust tolerance, number of tillers, number of kernels per spike, seed price, grain size, and grain color. So those are what we then used for making the conjoint analysis. And there were 14 different levels of those 6 traits. So 3 levels for the number of tillers. So we had 2 tillers, 5 tillers, and 8 tillers. That's number of productive tillers per plant. Density of kernels per spike were either dense or lax. Color of grain was red or white. Size was large or small. Resistance, either resistant or susceptible. And then price was based on a 100 kilogram bag of seed. Not grain, mind you, but seed for planting. And the prices for that were $650, $850, and $1,050. And the prices were determined based on what the normal price is at planting to purchase seed, what the price is basically for grain at harvest, so in case they just saved their seed and grew it again the next year. And then the highest price is typical of seed that's either really difficult to get, improved varieties, that kind of thing. So conjoint analysis is a well-known market technique, and the way it works is that it relies on a preference that a person's value for a specific product is made up of all of the traits that comprise that product as a whole. And so if you raise enough different combinations, then what you can do is you can get an estimate for an individual trait without actually asking what the preference is for an individual trait. So rather than saying, do you prefer blue top or red top on the bottle, you would ask a number of different combinations and what the value is to a specific person, and then you could actually gather one trait, even though you're not asking them to just. And the reason why this was done in this circumstance is because oftentimes when people are very familiar with a product, it's difficult for them to pick out just one thing that they can value on it. And so you can put traits together and different combinations of those to get an idea. So the way this is done is by using visual or pictorial representations instead of actual products. Because if you think about a product itself, like a plant, for instance, there's hundreds of traits, and we just want to really isolate 6 traits and ask them about those. So the best way to do that is to kind of remove as much of the unknowns as possible and show a picture, because some of them, like if they're really familiar, they might be able to tell exactly what variety the plant is by just looking at it. And then they have an opinion based on what they know, how well it grows, do they like the way it tastes. Or they might be looking at the width of the stalk, and that's not something that you're really trying to gauge from them. So here's some pictures of what the different levels look like in these graphic representations. So the number of productive tillers per plant, this represents 2, 5, and 8. And then the density of kernels per head are lax and dense. Color and size of grain is kind of tricky because color is based on it's relative to something else. So if you have just a picture of red or a picture of white, it's really difficult for somebody to gauge. Plus, cherry red or something is not exactly the color of wheat. Red is just a very slightly darker brownish color, basically. They call it red there. So I used actual varieties, and you also can't separate color and size because they come together in a seed. So the best thing here is to use the actual variety and show small white, large white, small red grain, and large red grain next to each other. These are just a few examples of what the cards look like. So there were 18 different cards that the respondents rated, and because there were 14 total levels of traits, to do a full factorial analysis of all, or full factorial breakdown of show a card for every different possible combination, there would have been 144 cards to show, which is way too much for anybody to handle. So you use a fractional factorial design, I think it was called, and that allowed me 16 cards basically that we could have shown. But I added 2 additional just to decrease the degrees of freedom in the long run. So they were rated on a scale of 0 to 6, 0 being that they would not grow the variety, or they would not purchase that seed under any circumstance, up until 6, which is that they would definitely purchase the variety. And I'll explain, well, I'll just go ahead and explain now. So what happened with rust resistance and susceptibility is that it's kind of a difficult trait to measure because it's contingent on there being an epidemic or rust coming through and infecting plants. So it's not an inherent trait, or it's an unseen inherent trait. The resistance, you can't actually see it. It's only once it's infected that then you can see the response that it has to either being resistant or susceptible. So what I did was I actually covered that and explained to people, and then if they wanted to see what the response would have looked like after it was infected, then that's when we would show what the resistant response looks like versus the susceptible response. So here's just what the scale looked like. So 0 to 6 definitely wouldn't buy. A 0 maybe buy. Anywhere along the scale they could mark, all the way up to definitely would buy. So this was done in 4 villages in 1 district, and there was 305 different surveys. So it was half male, half female, roughly, I think, give or take 1 or 2. And we tried to make it as even between female head of households and non-head of households. Here's some pictures of them doing the surveying. So they were one-on-one surveys, and each one took pretty long, like probably about an hour and a half. We had about 3 pages of demographic information, and then the 18 cards that they went through also. These were all done in rural places that were located near the homes of these people. So then, for the analysis, once I have a model, or I have a survey for each of the people, is that I did a regression for each person to have an individual preference model. And so this is just what that looks like, basically. So this is for respondent number 305. This is their rating for each of the 18 different varieties, or different cards. And then I used effects coding, meaning that you drop out one of each of the levels. And then you mark it either as 1 or -1 if they preferred that one or didn't prefer it. And then if there were 3 levels, you have -1, 0, and 1. Then that information was then used to calculate the relative importance, which is way over here on this side. So what you can see is you take the range between the highest, if I can see it here. So you've got 8 tillers, and there's 4.46 is the coefficient for that, so tillers 8 there. So take the highest and the lowest, so you got -0.55, and to calculate the missing one, you take the difference from 1. And then the range between the highest and lowest is divided by the total, and that's how you get the relative importance for each of those traits. So this person here puts a 25% importance on the on the number of tillers, with 8 tillers being their most preferred level, and so on. So then it's a 0.19% preference on size of seed, with large size being the preferred. So as you can see, that's basically what you get for each individual, is a model of what their most preferred trait is and which level of that trait. This is just an example of the demographic questions. There was 3 pages of demographic questions, and I asked kind of a lot of weird questions because I tried to preempt understanding thinking about why people might like red seed over white seed. So I asked questions like, do you think red seed is more nutritious or white seed is more nutritious? To then, when I run that information, to find out if that comes up, that the reason why people that are in a category that prefer red seed is also because they believe it's more nutritious. But it came out that not too much came out of a lot of these unusual questions. And also another one, you can't really see it here, but asking wealth is a tough one in rural areas because they may have livestock, and that's where their wealth is, so just asking income level is difficult. So I had to calculate a wealth index based on their number of livestock, what the livestock was worth at the time, and then the amount of income based on how many sacks of wheat they sold, plus other vegetables. So you can't really ask, like, do you make between $2,000 and $3,000 a year? It's not possible. So then for the cluster analysis, which comes next, is that you take each person's individual preference coefficient, you run those through the cluster analysis, which takes the two closest clusters and they merge them together to make a cluster. So when you do this for all 305 people, you get a list of anywhere from one cluster up to probably 305 clusters if you had individuals for each one. The significant range was basically between 4 clusters and 9 clusters. And I'll show you why. This is very confusing, I realize, but I just color-coded it to try to make sense. So this is 4 clusters here, and then this is 9 clusters here. And so you can see where, when you go from 4 to 5 clusters, it divides. Yellow divides there, then the next one, red divides twice, and this one, yellow divides again to make 3. So 7 clusters is actually the most interesting one, which is this here. And that captures the most variability among the different preferences. When you split it to 8, you get this red category here splits twice, but you don't get any new interest. It just splits, but they like the same things. So you don't learn anything new there. And the same thing happens here at the end, that 9 splits. But high price is still the most important trait to them. So I looked basically at this 7 cluster category to see what those preferences were. And so then what we have here, try to highlight these. So the first cluster here, cluster 1, their highest preference across all the groups was for seed size, and they prefer large seed. So then I named that group large seed. Then the next one, subcluster 1, and the reason why it's called subcluster is because it has a small sample size. So when it's run in the next analysis, it can't handle small samples, so I have to join subcluster 1 and subcluster 1, basically. But it has interesting preferences, so I didn't want to get rid of it entirely. So it prefers the productive tillers here. But it also has a preference for the cheapest seed, and it's the only one. Everybody else prefers the highest price seed. So that's why they're an interesting group, because they have a high preference for many productive tillers, but lowest price. So they theoretically could be like a group that uses tillers for feeding animals, but they don't sell. They mainly just produce wheat for their own home consumption. And so, because it was kind of a surprise to see that everybody had a preference for the highest price. But then it wasn't that much when you think that they're producers as well. So we're not just looking at people purchasing it, we're looking at people who are making it and selling it. So if they can sell it at the highest price, then they're also going to make profit on it. And that was their reasoning behind it too, because I started asking, why do you prefer the highest price seed? And it's because trust, they think it's better if it's more expensive, and also they can sell it and make more money. So the third cluster here had a highest preference for density, high dense kernels, and also seed color, and they preferred white seed. Subcluster 3 was a really strange one that didn't make any sense to anybody. They prefer lax, red, small seed, which just doesn't make any sense at all. But again, they're a really small group, so they could actually be outliers that just sort of got grouped together. I decided to keep them just to be able to run them through the demographics to see if there was anything interesting about that group. Cluster 4 here had, I missed a cluster. Oh, cluster 3 doesn't have any specific preferences. They're just kind of the same as the overall average. So they like everything that's typical and that you would imagine that they would like. Rust disease resistance is the favorite for cluster 4. And then cluster 5 is high-priced seed is their most important trait that influences their preference to purchase a variety or a seed. So this is just an example of what it would have looked like if you'd taken just an average of the overall sample. So just what I'm trying to show here, like number of tillers is the most preferred trait, with rust resistance and price kind of neck and neck there, and then it goes down from kernel density, grain color, and grain size last. So if you look at this chart, and then look at the next one, which this is, if you actually cluster it, then you can see that there's 7 different distinct market segments. And so if you just take the overall average, you're really missing out on a lot of opportunities for breeders to advance lines rather than just sticking to one sort of, thought that everything has to be high tillers, white seed. So this one is just a graphic representation of this one here. So it's just focusing on the preferences. So you can see this category here, which was cluster 1. They prefer number of tillers, but also seed color and seed size are their strongest elements. This last one here, price of seed, was the most important one. When I say most important, it's across all of the other segments. So obviously, number of tillers is still very important for all of the segments. But here, rust resistance is, I don't know how much more important, between 20 and 37%, 17% more important than number of tillers, for instance. So, this one then looks at the demographics of the people to try to see what's unique about the different clusters, the different market segments. And what we found to be statistically significant, again, it's because I asked quite a lot of unusual questions. I came up with quite a lot of unexplainable things. Like, so here you have red, these people are 50% of them believe that red and white seed have the same nutrition, which is nothing that surprising there, but 10% was the overall population opinion on that. White grain had more nutrition, the other 50% of them thought that. So that's for that category here. There were some differences between male and female, so 81%, which was statistically significant from the average, and also from this category here. The last one, were male head of household and female not head of household. There was 0% in the high yield, low price category, 34% in the high price category. So you can gain some interesting insight out of some of these things. Some of them you probably can't do too much with like here, do they use straw roofing? I thought that may explain why they like a lot of tillers. But the 2 categories that were statistically significant there preferred white grain, not number of tillers. So it's not anything really useful per se in that particular category. But in a marketing sense, you may be able to market people that have straw roofs because you know that they also prefer white grain. So it goes the other way as well, where you can tell, where the demographics can be used maybe to explain or to market towards specific segments. This is just to show you the variability. So again, this first one is the overall average, and then all the rest of them are the 7 clusters. As you can see, there's quite a lot of variability in between the first choice of the level based on the different segments. So then the multinomial low-jet modeling. The purpose of this is to try to predict membership in a segment based solely on the demographic and management information. And so with this, you're much less likely to actually get statistically significant areas. It basically means, in a marketing sense, that I could look at Amy, for instance, and say, because she's wearing an orange dress, I know that she prefers tea instead of coffee. Which, like, let's be honest, that's pretty hard to make those kinds of assumptions. But it's sort of the final step in this process in trying to see if you can identify characteristics about your segment. So again, I had to run only a 5 cluster model because it can't handle the small sample sizes, and so I had to join those clusters back with their parent cluster, I guess you'd call it. So what came up with this is there were a few significances, but not too many, and not too many that are very relevant, really. So cell phone was statistically significant at the under 10% here, and the ones that are in the lighter pink meant that they were above 10% but less than 20%. So cell phone actually came up as significant for 3 categories, for the first, the second, and the third market segments. But we can't assume things like, because it was cell phone, it's probably because they're men and because men have cell phones and women don't. Because we also asked their gender. So the gender then would come up. So there's something else going on that isn't explained by this, that people that have cell phones, actually for this one it's less likely, and this one it's less likely for people that have, wait a minute. People that are in those clusters are less likely to have a cell phone, whereas in this first cluster, they're 13.5% more likely to have a cell phone. For this one, this is some management questions that I asked. So do they how many times do they hand weed, I think was the question? Or hand weeding versus spray weeding. And so cluster 4 was statistically significant at 5% more likely to hand weed versus spray weeding. Little bit, but not super high in the, I mean, it was in between the less than 20% significance level for the 5th one. Did they have rust more than one time in the last 10 years? So the last group who's willing to pay the most for the seed was less likely to have had any rust problem at all in the last 10 years. Straw roof again came up as significant. Don't really know how to explain that. If they had family members that were, the number of family members that were educated above grade 8, they were 2.8% less likely to be in the second and cluster 2 here. And then again, high price, it's really not a surprise here because this is the group that prefers high price. So to say, yeah, they statistically significant that they prefer high price is not really a surprise, but it is statistically significant. So anyway, the conclusions to the study are that by simply taking overall averages, you're not accounting for the heterogeneity in population, and you're also not accounting for potential market segments that haven't been thought about or reached. The segmentation shows that traits are valued at considerably different levels by different types of farmers. There's not too much gender differences with regards to the agronomic traits, except for in the very small segments that have small n. The ability to design for varieties based on specific target groups you can get from these kinds of techniques, which could be interesting if you're funded by a project that really wanted to reach poor marginal farmers, for instance. This kind of study could show you maybe what, how to reach them and what their preferences would be. And the results could be helpful for promoting varieties in Ethiopia based on things that we showed that they're more likely to be in a specific group because they had a cell phone. Then you could maybe use cell phones for promoting certain varieties as well. And then it also just shows that there's future opportunities for more research and to focus on the post-harvest and quality traits. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Katie, for that very informative presentation. Now we will welcome this session for the for the questions from the audience. Any question from the audience? Questions? Okay. Matt.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I was trying to see to which degree it can be linked to an experimental option, but there is already a study done by Lusk who combines your conjoint analysis with an auction in the end, because I think that's the weak point, the pricing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how did you define? I mean, you have to come up with those sheets and then with prices. How did you define those prices?
The prices came based on what the price of seed is at planting time. So the middle price was an average price for seed at planting. The low price is what the cost of grain is at harvest. So in case people didn't sell it and they just saved it and planted again. So that's the difference there. And then the high price is the improved varieties because they're harder to get and they have rust resistance, and so yield is typically higher. Plus they're normally certified seeds and that sort of thing. So they were based on basically just asking people in the area what the prices are for seeds during that time. Some of the traditional varieties are also higher priced because they're harder to get, and they're actually lower yielding, but they're in such high demand. So it was based on, it was based on actual pricing, but I wasn't there at harvest, planting, and I was there during one period of time, and so they had to think about it in the sense of, okay, if I'm not paying for it and I'm just saving my seed, is that equivalent to paying $650 per seed? So it's different in that sense from the auction, where you're setting it up in a real setting that they have to purchase it. So just saying that, yeah, you buy it at that price is a lot different than being put into a circumstance where you've got money in your hands and you have to spend it. So yeah, there's...
Okay, no question?
Thank you, Katie, for this nice presentation. The first question, what you're doing in training? With no one there. It's a good question. The annual support me on that. No one doesn't work out. He says, what are you talking about? No, that's something different. But my question is, I had the impression that if you look, you found that color really didn't matter. The red versus white, the one whitish type of wheat. But I thought if you look at the market prices, there's a premium for Drilon, which is the whiter wheat, versus or spring wheat versus soft red, which is red color and used for feed purpose, because you cannot really use the red color for bakery and other stuff there.
In Ethiopia in particular, so I was just doing bread wheat. I wasn't looking at the difference between bread and durum wheat, which is.
But you had a color there, no? You had a
color, yeah. There's a color difference,
yeah.
And it's actually a difference basically between soft white wheat and hard white wheat. So there's not an actual hard red winter wheat.
So the protein contents are exactly the same.
No, the protein content is higher in the red wheat because it's like the texture is different. It's and that also prevents it from things like sprouting, because it has less moisture content in it. So it's it actually makes better bread, but they don't prefer it as much. They like the whiter one, but they want it to make bread. So the perception of the color itself is it's a tricky one in there. But there's not really, there's about the same price for both if in the market, and because they also use the red wheat for a specific specialty product. So they use that for making like the drink, the tala. They use it for other, there's different kinds of sizes of seed they make, because there's like 6 or 7 different dishes that they make using wheat, and they have different kinds of wheat that they prefer it for as well. So that, I think you asked that question yesterday also about, if you're putting that in front, then your willingness to pay for it depends on what you're going to make out of it. If it's a wedding and you're planning on making a specific dish, then you might be willing to pay really high price because you're only buying a small amount as opposed to a daily consumption of
I came in a little late, so I thought you were talking about rice. I didn't know what they allowed you to talk about, maybe. The first question, is there anyone else here or else doing the same kind of analysis on rice that you've been doing on wheat? And the second question is different. That is, none of the farmers, do they all just plant one variety, or do some people plant different varieties?
Yeah, no. So the first question, I would say, Maddie, there's a whole department now, right, that's going to be doing this, looking at preferences based on different, both consumer preferences and producer preferences, I imagine. I don't know if anybody's done this with breeders in the past, like looking at how you would feed this information back to a breeder to then allow, like, have them select certain varieties based on that. I don't know if that's been done here.
I'm sure they have done it in the past.
Yeah.
Not in the last few years, but I'm pretty sure conjoined analysis have been done here before.
And then
at the farmer's level, not at the farmer's level.
Yeah. And then the second question, most farmers grow, they don't actually want just one variety. They want to grow, even if they have a really tiny piece of land, they're growing 3 to 4 different varieties.
Well, that's interesting because you're diversifying your risk.
Yeah.
When I see a farmer even here, the first question I ask, are you planting more than one variety? Because you can't trust IRRI.
But that's also why it's somewhat of an issue. At the beginning, what you missed was that they're releasing a lot of varieties, but very, very few are being adopted. So really there's only one kind of improved rust-resistant variety that is well adopted there. And that's actually a really bad thing, because it's not, first of all, it's not adapted to all the different agroecological zones. It breaks down resistance much faster, and people themselves want more than one variety. And so you need to give them that. I mean, if you provide, different kinds of things for them based on their preferences, then but I think some of it also comes from the fact that CIMMYT does the breeding in Mexico, and it's not until they're elite lines and they're not making any more changes to them. They're just doing agroecological adaptation. So does it grow there or not? If it doesn't grow, they don't release it in Ethiopia. If it grows there, they release it. There's no actual, like, the breeder back in Mexico isn't thinking about the Ethiopian farmer when they're selecting that actual, selecting for specific traits early on in the generations.
Okay, any more questions?
Actually, I was about to ask the same question, but the first question given by Dr. Barker. But do you have plans of doing the same study, doing the same analysis, but using a different commodity, this time rice?
I mean, that's the thing. Right now I'm working in the training center doing stuff with extension and communications on research and how to bring research to the farmer. So I'm not actually connected to this type of research right now, but that's why I kind of wanted to give a presentation to explain, like, what I did during my research, so it's not, my skills aren't completely lost. I was really nervous actually coming in. I'm like, did I remember all the terms of these things and stuff? And I didn't actually have an advisor on my committee that was an economist, and so some of the stuff I was kind of, but I was also kind of nervous to give a talk to a bunch of social scientists and economists, because I have like breeders and agronomists on my committee who they don't have any idea what conjoint analysis is, so they were like.
But your major advisor was economist.
No. Ronnie Kaufman was my advisor. He's a breeder. Like, he doesn't have any idea about multinomial regression.
But he's never around.
He's never around.
Yeah, and basically, he's on the committee, but he wasn't ever around.
So your degree is in agronomy or?
Cornell.
But what's your specialization?
I did a degree in agronomy. And John, do you know John Duxbury?
Yeah.
So he was my advisor in agronomy, and then Sarah Davidson, who's also in plant biology, was my
Okay. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much, Katie, for that very nice presentation. Okay, we have an announcement here. Our very own Mr. Orly Velarde will give his exit seminar on April 19, that's Friday, at 1:30 p.m. After serving for almost 6